you doing here, Roy?
Robert's flight was delayed. Where is everything?
Every time you lie, I press this button,
I don't know what you're talking about.
and £50,000 leaves our joint account.
I haven't the slightest idea.
Different passcode.
It's me, Roy.
You just lost £50,000.
I mean, Hans.
How did Robert let you know his was delayed?
Well, he called me. But I mean, I don't know.
Let me save you some money. I'm leaving you this.
Where are you going?
Shut up!
In a quiet corner of London, an elderly widow named Betty McLeish sits at her computer, filling out a dating profile with the careful fingers of a woman who has not looked for love in a very long time. Across the city, an elderly man named Roy Courtnay is doing the same, typing out the details of a life he has invented for the occasion. They are both widowed, they are both alone, and within hours, the algorithm neither of them understands has decided they are a perfect match. The messages begin cautiously, stories about lost spouses, grown children, the quiet loneliness that comes with getting old, and then they agree to meet for dinner. What Roy does not yet know is that this dinner is not the beginning of a con. It is the beginning of a trap that has been waiting patiently for him for 70 years. At the restaurant, Roy arrives first, watching the door with the practiced patience of a man who has spent his life waiting for marks to walk into rooms he has already prepared for them. Betty enters, they exchange greetings, and over dinner she tells him softly that her husband and her son have both passed, and the only family she has left is her grandson, a serious young man named Stephen who lives with her. Roy nods sympathetically and tells her that his wife died 3 years ago. Then, in a moment that surprises them both, Roy admits something. The name on his profile, Brian, is not his real name. His real name is Roy Courtnay. Betty laughs, a warm, quiet laugh, and confesses that she has done the same. Her real name is Betty McLeish.
My name is, in fact, not Brian. Roy Courtnay.
I suppose now's the time that I tell you. My name actually isn't Estelle. Betty McLeish.
Betty.
The two of them laugh together at the coincidence of their shared little lie, and for a moment, they look like nothing more than two lonely people who have finally found someone who understands them. After dinner, Betty is picked up by Stephen.
Until next time, Roy.
Will you call? You're the string fellows.
And Roy heads not home but to a nightclub where a man named Vincent is already waiting for him at a booth with two other men. This is Roy's world. He leans in and pitches his newest scheme with the easy confidence of a man who has done this 1,000 times, a Russian businessman, an investment opportunity, an £800,000 pot waiting to be doubled, if only the four of them can put in $200,000 as a show of good faith. The men agree. They shake hands. They swear to keep their real names hidden. And then one of them, a nervous man named Bryn, blurts out his real name within seconds.
And to your point,
Ring.
first to break the rule.
I didn't say that, did I?
Roy smiles thinly. His phone buzzes. It is Betty. The next scene is a movie theater, and Roy is on his second date with Betty, watching her from the corner of his eye as she watches the screen. When the credits roll, they step out into the London night, and Roy's knees suddenly buckle beneath him. He winces, and Betty rushes to help him, slipping her arm under his and walking him home slowly like a woman guiding a child. But what Betty does not know is that Roy's knees are perfectly fine. What Betty does not know is that everything about the man leaning on her arm is a performance calibrated for her benefit. The next morning, in his apartment, Roy stands upright and pain-free, giving instructions to his staff to convert the space into a temporary office. Hours later, the four investors arrive alongside two well-suited Russians, and Roy walks them through the mechanics of the scheme with the calm precision of a real banker. He shows them a small electronic keypad, the device they will use to move money through their joint accounts, and he types in the £200,000 the investors have pooled together. The Russians prepare to transfer their $800,000. Everything is going exactly as planned, and then Bryn opens his mouth. He makes a crude joke about how much commission the Russians pay to Vladimir Putin. The room freezes. The Russians rise, unimpressed, and walk out with their money still in their pockets.
What the fuck was that?
They were not amused by you.
Roy looks at Bryn with the tired expression of a man who has been betrayed by an idiot and tells the group they will need to earn the Russians' trust back. That evening, Roy walks to Betty's house with his stick in hand and his limp perfectly rehearsed. Over dinner, she mentions casually that she has just bought a new car, in cash, and Roy's eyes flicker with a light that does not quite reach the rest of his face.
Leftovers.
Betty, are you back?
When Stephen arrives home to find this stranger sitting comfortably at his grandmother's table, his expression makes it very clear that Roy is not welcome. But Betty likes Roy. Betty trusts Roy. And when Stephen and Betty walk Roy home later that night and Betty realizes that Roy lives on the top floor of a building with no lift, she insists that he stay at her place. Stephen protests. Betty overrules him. And that is how Roy Courtnay moves his bags into the home of a woman worth several £1,000,000. The next morning, coffee in hand, Roy notices a stranger sitting in a silver Audi parked across the street watching the house. He watches back. Inside, he overhears Stephen warning his grandmother that she is letting a total stranger far too close, far too fast. Betty dismisses him. Roy files it away with the practiced calm of a man who has heard suspicious grandsons before. When he tells them he has urgent business, a friend suffering from pancreatic cancer at the hospital, Betty asks Stephen to drive him. Stephen drops him at the entrance and drives off. Roy waits a beat, then slips out the back door, tosses his stick aside, and walks briskly down the street with the healthy stride of a man who has never had knee trouble in his life. At the office, the Russians return. Bryn apologizes for his behavior, and as a gesture of good faith, the four men have doubled their pot to £400,000. Roy transfers it to the joint account with a smile. The Russians transfer their share. The deal is finally closed. One of the Russians embraces Bryn in celebration, and it is only in that embrace that Bryn feels the wires beneath the man's jacket. The sirens outside begin to wail. Bryn and his partner sprint out the back door, and the moment they disappear, the room breaks character. Because Roy, Vincent, the police, and the two Russians have all been working together the entire time. Bryn and his partner were the marks. £200,000 have just changed hands, and Roy Courtnay is once again richer than he was this morning. But what Roy does not know is that a very different game is already being played on him. Roy returns to the hospital gate and reunites with Stephen with the bereaved expression of a man who has just visited a dying friend. At dinner, Stephen mentions casually that he is going away for research to a place called Spandau Prison, where Nazi war criminals were kept, and then he asks Roy a question that lands with more weight than it should. Did Roy serve in the war? Roy pauses. He touches the small scar at his throat and admits that yes, he was in the army. Later, walking Stephen out, he sees the silver Audi again. The same man, the same watchful eyes.
Are you sure it's the same car? Well, I don't know who it is.
Days pass. Roy and Vincent pay a visit to a Russian butcher named Vlad, one of the men who played the Mark's Russian buyer in their scam. Vlad wants more money for his part in the performance. Roy does not intend to give it to him. Instead, he calls in two of his men. What happens next, we do not see. What happens next, we do not need to see.
I'm exploring the joys.
Then comes the true target. Roy brings Vincent to Betty's house and introduces him as his financial advisor. Vincent begins his slow, gentle work. He mentions that Roy would like to leave something for Betty in his will. Betty is touched, moved, and softly protests that Roy should leave everything to his son Robert. Roy scoffs and says he does not approve of his son's lifestyle. Over the course of a leisurely afternoon, Vincent draws Betty into conversation until she reveals the number he's been fishing for all along, £2.8 million. Vincent's pitch slides in effortlessly: a joint investment account, doubled returns in 5 years, complete safety. Betty smiles. Betty listens. Betty says she needs time to think.
There was a man.
The next morning, over coffee in the garden, Roy tells Betty proudly that his own investments have already turned a £20,000 profit. Just then, Stephen arrives home early from work. He sees the paperwork on the table. He looks at his grandmother and tells her plainly that she is trusting a man she barely knows with everything she owns. Betty is hurt. Vincent takes the temperature of the room and excuses himself, saying this is not the right day for business. Later, Stephen apologizes, and Roy graciously suggests that $10,000 of his profit be given to Stephen as a gesture of goodwill, and the remaining $10,000 should fund a small trip. Betty is charmed. Betty is grateful. Betty says she has always wanted to go to Berlin. That afternoon, as Betty is trimming Roy's hair, telling him gently about a city she has not seen in a very long time, she suddenly loses her balance and collapses to the floor. Roy panics. He reaches for the phone. Betty stops him and asks him only to call her doctor. The diagnosis is delivered quietly. She has had another stroke. Betty does not want treatment. She does not want surgeries and bed rest. She does not want to spend her final years living as if she is already dead. And that night, as Roy tucks her into bed and looks at the fragile shape of the woman beneath the covers, he tells her that he will take her to Berlin.
Berlin.
Good.
But what Roy does not yet realize is that Berlin is a city he should never, ever go back to. The next day, out shopping, Roy sees a familiar face in the crowd. Bryn, the man he cheated out of £100,000, is following him through London. Roy arranges to meet Betty at a restaurant in an hour and moves quickly to the underground. Bryn follows him down. On the platform, Bryn confronts him, tells him he has figured out the entire scam and demands his money back, or he will walk straight to Betty and expose everything. Roy listens. Roy waits for the crowd to thin, and then Roy pushes him. Bryn falls to the tracks. Roy walks calmly up the stairs and disappears into the London afternoon. He meets Betty at the restaurant with a slight tremor in his voice and tells her that suddenly, urgently, he wants to fly to Berlin as soon as possible. They arrive in the city days later, and Stephen is already there, ready to guide them through the museums and monuments of a city drenched in old wars. For a while, they play the part of tourists. Then Betty says she needs to go somewhere alone, that she will meet them back at the hotel. Roy watches her walk away. The scene cuts to Betty standing in front of an old apartment building, staring up at it with an expression that has been waiting decades to arrive on her face. When she returns to the hotel, her hand is bandaged. She says she slipped on the pavement.
You're huffing and puffing. No, come.
Roy kisses her wounded fingers, and Betty leans into him with the tender gratitude of a woman who has finally found someone who cares. The following morning, Stephen leads the couple to an old building in the city, and the moment Roy steps inside, something in his chest tightens. He knows this place. He has been here before. Stephen watches him closely and then, very calmly, tells Roy that he has been through his service records. He knows Roy was deployed to Berlin after the war. He knows Roy came to this exact building in 1948, and he knows that on the day Roy visited, a murder was committed here. Roy's face changes. The mask slips.
Told us he was wounded in the war.
I must correct you. V section was not headquartered.
And for the first time in the film, Roy Courtnay tells the truth. He tells them he was working for an intelligence agency hunting down Nazi war criminals. He tells them he was sent to Berlin in 1948 to apprehend a powerful Nazi named Martin Geiger. The story slips into flashback. A young British soldier named Roy and his German translator, a young man named Hans Taub, knocked on the door of Geiger's residence. A man answered and said Geiger was not home, but the soldiers insisted on waiting, and the man walked to the kitchen to make coffee. He was Geiger. He returned with a knife pressed to Hans's throat. Roy lowered his weapon. Geiger took it, and in the struggle that followed, the British soldier was killed. Hans survived, and then, in the present, the man calling himself Roy Courtnay confesses the second half of the truth. His real name is Hans Taub.
And who wasn't?
It all happened so quickly.
When the British soldier died in that room, his face was so badly disfigured that Hans saw an opportunity. Their features had always been similar. His English was flawless. He took the dead man's papers, took his identity, moved to London, and lived out the rest of his life as an Englishman named Roy Courtnay.
A clean break was the best solution.
Stephen is horrified. He turns to Betty and tells her to walk away from this man immediately. But Betty does not move. Betty looks at Roy and tells Stephen, gently and firmly, to stop interfering in their lives. Stephen leaves the room, and Betty, alone with the man who has just confessed to being a wartime imposter, tells him that when he is with her, she does not feel alone. What Roy does not know is that every word she has just said was written years before either of them arrived in this city. Back in London, Betty picks up the phone and calls Vincent. She has made her decision. She wants to transfer every penny she has into the joint account she will share with Roy. Vincent, uneasy, tries to convince Roy to leave at least some of the money in Betty's name. She is sick, after all, and she will need care. But Roy is not interested in leaving her a single pound. A few days later, Vincent arrives at the house and walks the elderly couple through the paperwork, handing each of them a separate keypad and setting up the transfer. Betty hesitates for a moment, wondering aloud if perhaps she should keep just a little for herself, given her health. Roy watches her carefully. Then, in a gesture of what looks like pure love, he transfers every penny of his own wealth into the joint account first. Betty smiles. Betty transfers hers. Together, they choose a password, 6 letters, drawn from the painting of a lily on the wall behind them. L-I-L-I-E-S.
Congratulations.
You should celebrate with champagne.
I'm afraid I'm driving.
What? Ooh.
Vincent, thank you.
Until next time.
The next day, Roy pretends to receive a call from his son Robert, who is passing through London and wants to see him. Roy protests. Betty insists he go. He packs his bag carefully, slipping his keypad inside, and heads to the kitchen to fetch a glass of water, while Betty stays behind in the living room, her eyes drifting quietly toward his open bag. At the train station, Roy kisses her goodbye with a rehearsed reluctance, and Betty waves him off with a soft smile. He checks into a hotel room. He pours himself a drink. He rummages through his bag for the keypad, the small piece of plastic that controls £3 million, and it is not there. He calls the bank. The bank cannot help him without the device. A replacement, they tell him, will take several days. Roy sets down the phone. Roy stares at the wall. And Roy, for the first time in his life, feels the ground begin to move beneath him. He races back to Betty's house. It is empty, and then Betty steps into view, holding the missing keypad in her hand.
Robert's flight was delayed.
Roy launches into a frantic story about his son's flight being delayed. Betty watches him calmly, and then Betty tells him a rule. For every lie he tells her from this moment on, she will transfer £50,000 out of their joint account and into her personal one. She listens. He lies. She types. In under a minute, £200,000 have vanished from Roy's grasp.
Isn't it beginning to sink in just a little bit?
Betty, what the hell is going on?
There is no Robert. You have no son.
His voice breaks. He asks her who she really is, and Betty turns his head toward the painting of the lily on the wall. The flashback that follows is not the one Roy has been telling. It is the one Roy has been running from for 70 years. In 1948 Berlin, a young girl named Lily lived with her father, her mother, and her 3 beautiful sisters. She was madly in love with the German boy who came to teach her English. His name was Hans. One afternoon, waiting for Lily, Hans wandered toward the sound of music and found her 3 sisters practicing a dance. One of them invited him to join, and Hans, for reasons he did not himself understand, turned violent. He tore the girl's dress. He walked into Lily's room, and he forced himself on the girl who loved him. When he came back down the stairs, the sisters were standing with their father, who berated him for what they had seen. Hans lied. Hans said the sister had tried to kiss him. Hans was thrown out of the house, and Hans, humiliated, retaliated the only way a small angry boy in that time and place could retaliate. He denounced the family, accused them of collaborating with the British. Lily's father was executed. Her mother took her own life. 3 of the 4 sisters died in the bombings that followed. Only Lily survived.
They'd let me sleep so I was unharmed.
And now, in this living room, 70 years later, Lily has come back to collect what she is owed.
Becoming a very good liar.
Roy tries to argue. He tells her she has no proof he is Hans Taub. Betty smiles and tells him about that afternoon in Berlin when she came back to the hotel with an injured hand. She had gone back to her old family home, which had been converted into a children's charity. In her old room, she had opened a secret compartment in the floor and taken out a locket she had hidden there as a girl, a locket containing strands of Hans's hair. She has all the proof she needs.
My silver locket with your hair in it. I already had a sample.
She tells him that Vincent, cornered by Stephen months earlier and threatened with exposure of his own crimes, has been working for her the entire time. She tells him that Stephen is not her grandson. The man in the silver Audi, however, is. The 2 of them have staged every conversation, every warning, every quiet objection Roy has ever overheard. She tells him she never had a stroke. The doctor was in on it. Every step of the way, Roy has been dancing to a choreography written by the girl he destroyed in 1948.
And that's why I came back.
She hands him back his keypad. She tells him there is £100,000 left in his account, and she turns to leave. Roy lunges at her. Betty deflects him and calls for help. Two men step into the room the Russian butcher Roy tried to have killed, and one of the investors Roy scammed. The door closes, and the last sound in the room is Roy Courtnay screaming. The film cuts to a hospital room. Roy lies in a bed, his body paralyzed, his eyes the only part of him still capable of moving. Vincent walks in, holding a small drink. He puts the straw to Roy's lips. Roy sips. And somewhere across the city, in a house filled with light and noise, Lily sits at the center of a long table surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren.
Oh, yes, please.
I was hoping you'd keep him.
Laughing at something one of them has said. Her family alive around her in a way she has not felt for the better part of a century. Some debts do not close when the war ends. Some prices are paid in a currency the courts do not accept. And sometimes the only justice a woman can find is the one she builds herself. One lie at a time, over the course of 70 patient years.
All right, Gran.
Like if the wrong people finally got what they earned.